You just opened a beer or poured yourself a glass of wine after a long day, and your brain, the thing designed to keep you alive, looks at it and thinks, yeah, that seems fine. Why? Alcohol has been responsible for an impressive number of bad decisions throughout human history, and yet nearly every civilization on Earth figured it out on their own, not once, not a few times, over and over again, in places that had never heard of each other. That's not an accident, that's a pattern. And the answer to that question will take you somewhere you don't expect. Not a party, not a lucky accident, but a funeral, 13,000 years ago. Hit like and subscribe before we get into it. Unlike alcohol, this one usually improves your judgment. All right, let's go. In 2018, archaeologist Li Liu and her team made a surprising discovery inside Raqefet Cave in northern Israel. Hidden within a series of stone mortars were microscopic traces of wheat and barley that had been malted, mashed, and fermented. In other words, beer. Not possible beer, not suspected beer, beer. And not just any beer. The oldest confirmed evidence of beer production ever found. Now picture the scene. It is 13,000 years ago. The people gathered here are Natufians, a community of hunter-gatherers living long before cities, kingdoms, or written history. Someone has died. Relatives arrive from nearby camps. Voices are quiet. Food is prepared. Stories are shared. A burial ceremony is about to begin inside the cave. And somewhere nearby, grain is being processed, crushed, mixed with water, and left to ferment. Not for a feast, not for a celebration, but for a funeral. Let that sink in for a second. When most people imagine the invention of beer, they picture a party, a lucky accident, a prehistoric version of happy hour. But the earliest clear evidence points somewhere very different. The story begins with death, and that changes the way we think about alcohol entirely. Because beer is not easy to make. Even with modern equipment, brewing requires planning. For hunter-gatherers, it required even more. Grain had to be collected, processed, prepared, and carefully fermented. This was not something people stumbled into on a random afternoon. It required intention, which makes one detail especially difficult to explain. The Natufians were not farmers. They did not cultivate fields. They were still hunter-gatherers, and yet they were already investing valuable time and energy into brewing beer. The longer you think about that, the stranger it becomes. The people of Raqefet Cave were hunter-gatherers, but they were not loners wandering the landscape in small, isolated groups. In fact, the evidence suggests something very different. Archaeologists have found signs that Natufian communities regularly gathered together in large numbers. They buried their dead in shared cemeteries. They decorated graves with flowers. They exchanged ornaments and jewelry, and some individuals appear to have been cared for through serious injuries and illnesses that would have been difficult to survive alone. Let that sink in for a second. None of this points to people who only cared about their next meal. It points to people who cared about each other. Now imagine one of these gatherings. Families arrive from neighboring camps. Some have not seen each other for months. Food is prepared. Stories are shared. News travels. Children play. Old friendships are renewed. New relationships begin. A few future marriages are probably being negotiated somewhere in the crowd. Human beings have always been remarkably efficient at turning social events into networking opportunities. As the gathering grows, so does something else. A sense of belonging, a feeling that you are part of something larger than yourself. And this is where beer starts becoming interesting. Because alcohol is not especially useful when you are sitting alone in the wilderness. It does not help you hunt. It does not help you build shelter. It does not help you outrun a predator. But in a social gathering, that is a different story. A shared drink can become a shared experience, a ritual, a symbol. A reason for people to sit together a little longer, talk a little more, laugh a little louder. Suddenly, the effort required to make beer begins to make more sense. Because the Natufians were not investing all that time and energy into a beverage, they may have been investing in something much more valuable: community. And if that is true, it leads to a much bigger possibility. What if beer was not simply a product of human gatherings? What if it helped create them? That idea may sound a little ridiculous. After all, we are talking about beer. Not fire, not tools, not agriculture. Beer. But some archaeologists have seriously considered the possibility. One of them is Brian Hayden, an archaeologist at Simon Fraser University. He is best known for a controversial idea often called the beer before bread hypothesis. The basic argument goes like this: large social gatherings require food, lots of food. And if beer played an important role in those gatherings, people would need a reliable supply of grain to make it. Now picture a Natufian community preparing for a major event. Dozens of people are expected to arrive. Food must be collected. Resources must be organized. And if beer is part of the occasion, wild grain suddenly becomes much more valuable. Not just as something to eat, but as something to brew. The more often these gatherings happen, the more useful it becomes to have grain available year after year, which creates an interesting problem. Wild grain does not always cooperate. Nature rarely schedules harvest season around your social calendar. Somehow, nature never learned basic event planning. And this is where the story takes another strange turn. For decades, archaeologists assumed agriculture came first, then beer came later. But Hayden suggested the relationship might not be that simple. What if the desire for communal feasts helped encourage people to collect, manage, and eventually cultivate grain? What if beer was not a consequence of civilization? What if it was one of the forces helping push humans toward it? To be clear, this idea remains debated among archaeologists. No one believes beer alone created civilization. Some researchers point out that the earliest farming sites show grain being used for food long before any evidence of brewing. In some regions, agriculture appears with no sign of communal feasting at all. So the relationship between beer and farming was probably messier than any single theory can explain. Still, the possibility is fascinating, because it suggests that some of the earliest steps toward farming may have been driven by something more than survival, something social, something symbolic, something that brought people together. And if beer really became that important, another question immediately appears. Why were humans so attracted to it in the first place? And this is where the story gets really strange. Because what if the Natufians never invented their attraction to alcohol at all? What if they inherited it? In 2014, biologist Matthew Kerrigan and his colleagues studied a gene called ADH4. This gene produces an enzyme that helps break down ethanol in the body. Ethanol, of course, is the alcohol found in beer, wine, and countless questionable life choices. What the researchers discovered was surprising. Around 10 million years ago, a version of this enzyme evolved in one of our ancient primate ancestors that was dramatically better at processing ethanol. Let that sink in for a second. 10 million years ago. Not 10,000, not 100,000. 10 million. And there is an interesting explanation for why this happened. Picture a tropical forest long before humans existed. No cities, no farms, no beer, no breweries proudly advertising craft IPA since 2018. Just trees, fruit, and hungry primates. As fruit ripens and falls to the forest floor, naturally occurring yeast begins feeding on the sugars inside it. This process is called fermentation. Fermentation produces ethanol. In other words, some of the fruit was naturally alcoholic. Not enough to start a prehistoric karaoke night, but enough to matter. This idea became known as the drunken monkey hypothesis, proposed by biologist Robert Dudley. The hypothesis suggests that the smell of ethanol may have helped ancient primates locate ripe, calorie-rich fruit. The stronger the smell, the better the chance of finding valuable food. In a world where calories were difficult to obtain, that was a useful skill. And over millions of years, natural selection may have favored individuals who were attracted to that signal. Suddenly, the story looks very different. The Natufians may not have invented a desire for alcohol. They may have inherited a biological attraction that had already been evolving for millions of years. Your ancestors were not searching for cocktails. They were just extremely serious about free fruit, which creates an even bigger mystery, and that creates a strange pattern. Because the Natufians were not the only ones. Thousands of years later, people in China were fermenting rice. People in Georgia were making wine. People in Mesopotamia were brewing beer. And somehow, the same idea kept appearing again and again, even in places that had never met each other. And that is where an even stranger pattern begins to emerge. Because the Natufians were not alone. Thousands of years later, people living in completely different parts of the world kept discovering fermentation. In China, at a site called Jiahu, archaeologists found evidence of a fermented drink made from rice, honey, and fruit dating back roughly 9,000 years. In what is now Georgia, chemical traces preserved inside ancient pottery revealed some of the oldest known wine production on Earth, dating back around 8,000 years. In Mesopotamia, beer became so important that it appeared in written records, religious ceremonies, and worker rations. And in Egypt, laborers were regularly supplied with bread and beer as part of their daily diet. Let that sink in for a second. These societies were separated by vast distances, different languages, different beliefs, different environments. No internet, no YouTube, no TikTok, no prehistoric influencer posting fermentation tutorials. And yet, they all ended up discovering the same strange process. Take grain, or fruit, or honey. Add time, add microorganisms, and eventually, alcohol appears. Now picture this happening over and over again across thousands of years. Different people, different continents, different civilizations, but remarkably similar results. The details changed, the ingredients changed, the traditions changed, but one thing stayed the same. Once people discovered fermentation, they rarely abandoned it. And that is what makes this story so unusual. Humans encountered countless plants, chemicals, and natural substances throughout history. Most were forgotten. Some were useful, but very few became woven into rituals, celebrations, religions, and everyday life across multiple civilizations. Alcohol did, again and again. Which suggests that people were not simply attracted to alcohol itself, they were attracted to something alcohol provided. Something valuable enough to survive thousands of years of cultural change. And that leads to a much more interesting question. What exactly were people getting from it? Because the answer may explain why alcohol kept appearing in some of the most important moments of human life. To answer that, we need to look at when alcohol actually appears in human life. And the pattern is surprisingly consistent. It shows up during the moments that matter most. At Rakfet Cave, beer appears alongside a funeral. In ancient Sumer, beer became part of religious festivals and communal celebrations. The Sumerians even had a goddess of beer named Ninkasi. Most civilizations do not create deities for things they consider unimportant. And then there was Egypt. Beer was associated with rituals connected to Osiris, the god of agriculture, rebirth, and the afterlife. Different cultures, different languages, different gods. But the same pattern keeps appearing. Alcohol shows up at the edges of ordinary life, at the moments humans most needed to feel connected to something larger than themselves. Now picture a Sumerian festival, hundreds of people gathering together, food being shared, stories being told, music, laughter, probably at least one person making a decision that seemed brilliant at the time. Some traditions survive remarkably well, and this is where modern neuroscience becomes interesting. Alcohol affects two key systems in the brain: dopamine, which drives reward and motivation, and GABA, which quiets anxiety and lowers social barriers. In other words, alcohol does not just make people feel good, it makes people feel good together. And that is a very different thing. Researchers studying social bonding have found that shared experiences strengthen group connections in ways that solitary ones rarely do. Alcohol is not the only shortcut humans found to get there, but it may have been one of the most consistent. Which leads to a simple but strange conclusion. Maybe people were never really after the alcohol itself. Maybe they were after what it helped unlock. And maybe that is why it kept appearing, across cultures and centuries, in the moments humans needed each other most. So the next time you open a beer or pour yourself a glass of wine after a long day, your brain looks at it and thinks, yeah, that seems like a good idea. And here's the strange part, it's not wrong. Not because alcohol is good for you, but because what your brain is actually reaching for is something much older than the drink itself. Connection, belonging, the feeling that you are part of something bigger than yourself. Humans have never been particularly good at living alone. We build families, communities, cities, group chats that should have died 3 years ago. And somewhere along the way, alcohol found a place inside that story. Not because we wanted ethanol, but because we wanted what it sometimes helped create. Which means that craving you feel at the end of a long day, it probably has very little to do with alcohol and everything to do with being human. 13,000 years of evidence would seem to agree. And alcohol isn't the only substance humans kept returning to across centuries. Next time, we're going somewhere a little more unexpected. One question before you go. The Natufians brewed beer for a funeral, not a celebration, a funeral. Would you have shown up? Let me know in the comments. And if this made you think differently about something you do every day, share it with someone you'd actually want to have a drink with. See you soon.